why this design could never be repeated. At the time, it felt like a perfect storm. The right people, the right resources, the right moment in history. And once it passed, no one could recreate it, no matter how hard they tried. Because this design wasn't just a product of engineering, it was a product of circumstance. To understand why it could never be repeated, we need to return to a narrow window when rules were flexible, expectations were unclear, and pressure hadn't yet hardened into process. The industry was transitioning. Old assumptions were weakening, but new ones hadn't fully formed. That gap created freedom. Engineers were allowed to explore without immediate justification. Teams collaborated across boundaries that would later solidify. Decisions were made quickly, guided by intuition as much as data. There was trust, not because outcomes were guaranteed, but because the future was still undefined. The design absorbed all of that. It combined ideas that normally wouldn't coexist. Simplicity without austerity, innovation without spectacle, performance without obsession. Every compromise was negotiated in real time, not enforced by policy. The result was a machine that felt unusually coherent, because it wasn't built under rigid constraints. Early tests surprised everyone. The car behaved naturally across conditions. Nothing stood out, and nothing felt missing. It didn't chase extremes. It balanced them. Engineers struggled to explain why it worked so well, because no single decision accounted for the harmony they were seeing. That harmony was fragile. As success drew attention, the environment changed. Oversight increased. Documentation expanded. Processes hardened. The freedom that shaped the design began to vanish, replaced by safeguards meant to prevent risk, not encourage discovery. Attempts to repeat the project followed familiar steps. New teams, updated tools, better simulations. But something was missing. The same choices no longer aligned. The same shortcuts were no longer allowed. The same trust no longer existed. What once felt organic now felt forced. The design hadn't relied on secret technology. It relied on conditions that no longer existed, and that made it impossible to reproduce. Not because engineers forgot how to build it, but because the system that allowed it to emerge had closed. The car became a quiet reference point, not a template. A reminder that some breakthroughs don't come from better planning. They come from moments when planning briefly steps aside. And once that moment passes, no amount of effort can bring it back unchanged. As the industry tried to understand what had been lost, postmortems multiplied. Teams dissected the design in exhaustive detail, hoping to extract a formula they could reuse. They documented decisions, mapped dependencies, archived lessons learned. None of it worked. What they failed to capture was the absence of constraint that shaped those decisions in the first place. The design had emerged before every choice required justification, before every deviation demanded approval. It was born in a moment when trust outweighed fear. That balance didn't last. Success attracted scrutiny. Scrutiny attracted rules. Rules attracted caution. Each layer added protection, but also friction. The very processes meant to preserve quality slowly erased the conditions that made the design possible. Engineers felt it immediately. Attempts to recreate it revealed a painful truth. You could copy the architecture. You could copy the materials. You could copy the specifications. But you couldn't copy the freedom. Without that freedom, the same decisions led to different outcomes. Compromises piled up earlier. Interfaces grew heavier. Safeguards multiplied. The harmony that once emerged naturally had to be engineered deliberately and lost its balance in the process. The design's reputation grew with time. Engineers who worked on it spoke of it quietly, almost nostalgically, not because it was perfect, but because it felt honest. It reflected a way of working that no longer fit the modern industry. Leadership acknowledged this privately. They understood that repeating the design would require dismantling systems built to manage scale, risk, and accountability. It would mean accepting uncertainty again. Few organizations were willing to do that, so the design remained singular, not because it couldn't be improved, but because it couldn't be reborn under the same conditions. And that realization carried a lesson far beyond one vehicle. Progress doesn't always scale. Some breakthroughs belong to moments, not roadmaps. And when those moments pass, the most you can do is remember what they felt like and try imperfectly to protect space for the next one to appear. With time, the design took on a different role. It stopped being a benchmark for replication and became a reference for restraint. Engineers no longer asked how to rebuild it. They asked what it represented. It represented trust. Trust between disciplines. Trust between management and engineers. Trust that not every decision needed immediate validation. That trust had allowed intuition and experience to operate alongside data, not beneath it. In later projects, that balance was harder to achieve. Teams worked under tighter timelines. Metrics arrived earlier. Decisions were locked sooner. The system favored predictability over coherence. Each change reduced risk, but also reduced the chance for emergent harmony. The design's absence became instructive. When newer vehicles felt over-engineered, engineers pointed to it as an example of what was missing. When interfaces grew heavier, they remembered how little explanation that car required. When compromises piled up, they recalled how few had been necessary before. The design became a quiet teacher, not a technique, but of environment. It showed that great outcomes don't always come from better tools or smarter people. They come from conditions that allow people to think, explore, and adjust without fear of immediate consequence. Some leaders try to recreate those conditions artificially. They launched innovation labs, skunkworks teams, isolated projects shielded from normal processes. A few came close. Most failed because freedom imposed from above is still constraint, and separation from reality creates different problems. The original design wasn't protected from the organization. It was trusted by it. That distinction mattered. As the industry matured, it accepted a trade-off it rarely articulated. Scale demanded structure. Structure reduced spontaneity. And spontaneity, once lost, was difficult to reintroduce without risking chaos. The design existed at the edge of that trade-off, a reminder of what was possible when systems loosened just enough to let people work as humans, not roles. It couldn't be repeated, but it didn't need to be. Its purpose wasn't to define a future. It was to reveal what disappears when certainty takes over. And that revelation would shape decisions long after the car itself faded from the spotlight. The legacy of the design settled into the industry quietly, without ceremony. It wasn't celebrated in anniversaries or revived through retro editions. Instead, it lived on as a reference engineers carried in their heads, a memory of balance. When teams felt boxed in by process, they remembered it. When products grew heavier with justification, they remembered it. When innovation felt forced instead of discovered, they remembered what had once happened when trust was allowed to lead. The design never became a rule. It became a warning. A reminder that optimization can erase harmony, that control can suffocate coherence, and that not every breakthrough should be systematized into permanence. Years later, some of its principles resurfaced in unexpected places. Smaller teams, shorter decision loops, project allowed to remain unfinished longer, not because leaders chase nostalgia, but because they recognize the cost of losing creative space entirely. The design had taught them something uncomfortable. You can protect an organization from failure so thoroughly that you also protect it from greatness. That trade-off is rarely acknowledged, but it shapes everything that follows. The car itself aged gracefully, admired by those who understood what it represented. Not perfection, not superiority, but possibility. A glimpse of what emerges when structure loosens just enough for insight to breathe. Why this design could never be repeated was never really about the car. It was about the moment, a moment when uncertainty was tolerated, trust outweighed fear, and decisions were allowed to be human. Those moments are rare. They cannot be scheduled. They cannot be scaled. But when they happen, they leave behind something far more valuable than product. They leave behind a memory of what progress can feel like when it isn't afraid of itself. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Why